Miami at night is a carnival of noise, sweat, and neon, but behind the music and the perfume of ocean salt, there's always the other smell, the one you don't notice until it's too late: gasoline, cheap whiskey, gun oil. I'd been driving cab for 12 years and learned that every ride is a confession. Some confess by silence, some by chatter, but nobody climbs into a taxi without carrying the weight of their life. Mine was always the same: bills stacked like bricks, the taste of cigarettes I couldn't quit, the photo of my daughter who didn't call me anymore. Survival was the only map I trusted, and even that felt like a borrowed compass. That night started like the others: a string of drunk tourists, a hedge fund creep who left cologne on the back seat, a dancer from Little Havana who stared at her phone the whole ride. I was thinking about ending early when two men in suits waved me down outside a hotel on Collins Avenue. They didn't look like tourists. They looked like they'd never carried a bag in their lives, and yet one of them had a gym duffel so heavy it bent the seat when he threw it inside. Their Spanish was fast and sharp, not the soft Miami kind, but I kept my eyes on the road and mouth shut. My job wasn't to understand. My job was to drive. They argued the whole ride, half in Spanish, half in broken English, and when I dropped them in a quiet corner of Wynwood, they stepped out so fast they didn't even check the trunk. I waited a minute, engine idling, smoke curling in the mirror. Then I drove 2 blocks before realizing the duffel was still there. It wasn't mine, but neither was anything in my life. Curiosity beat fear. I pulled over under a busted streetlight and opened the trunk. Bundles. Wrapped tight, bricks of green paper, each stamped and sealed like it had a passport. My fingers went numb before my brain did. Money. More than I had ever seen in one place. I didn't count, but the smell of ink and glue told me this wasn't thousands. It was millions. A suitcase of time, years of bills, freedom stacked in columns. My first thought was to call the company, report it, pretend I hadn't looked. But when I closed the trunk and sat back in the driver's seat, the city felt different. The air hummed like it was waiting for me to decide who I was going to be. I drove home slow, heart jackhammering, convinced every cop car was coming for me. By the time I pulled into the shadow of my crumbling apartment block, I had already made the first of 1,000 lies I'd need to tell: that I was still just a driver, that the bag was just another lost umbrella, that nobody would ever come looking. But the Sinaloa Cartel doesn't misplace $8 million. And the man who takes it doesn't stay invisible for long. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the floor with the duffel open, counting in silence until dawn. 8 million. Enough to vanish, enough to start over, enough to finally feel like the universe hadn't been laughing at me since birth. But every stack was also a curse, a chain link dragging me into a war I hadn't chosen. That was the first night I realized you can steal money, but you can't steal peace. The morning after felt like a hangover without the liquor. The city outside my window buzzed with its usual rhythm: sirens, horns, the muffled bass of someone's party still going from the night before. But inside my apartment, everything was frozen in the silence of $8 million stacked neatly inside a duffel. I tried to convince myself I could treat it like found money, like winning a lottery ticket nobody would claim, but the weight in the air said otherwise. It wasn't luck. It was a hook, already set deep in my throat. I showered, shaved, and tried to go back to work, but every passenger felt like a spy. The old lady with her groceries glanced at me like she knew. The 2 frat kids laughing in the back seat suddenly seemed like they were laughing at me. My palms sweated so badly I nearly rear-ended a bus. I kept seeing the bag in my trunk even when it wasn't there. I had locked it in my closet, double-wrapped in garbage bags, as if plastic could disguise the smell of trouble. By noon, paranoia had turned into calculation. 8 million wasn't something you deposited into Wells Fargo. It wasn't something you bought a house with overnight. It was too loud. Money like that needed laundering, moving, disguising, and I didn't know a single man who could handle that without selling me out. So I did what I always did: I drove. The hum of the engine was the closest thing to prayer I had. I told myself if I just kept moving, the problem would stay behind me. But the city is a circle, and you always end up back where you started. It was late afternoon when the first crack appeared. A police cruiser pulled me over on Biscayne. The cop leaned into my window, all smirk and sunglasses. He asked for license and registration, but his eyes weren't on my paperwork, they were on me, studying, weighing. I'd been stopped plenty before, but this time his tone was different. He asked if I'd seen anything unusual last night, if I'd picked up two men from Collins. My throat closed. I said no. He let me go, but the way his smile lingered in my rear view was worse than handcuffs. That night I didn't go home. I drove until the gas needle kissed empty, parked by the bay, and lit a cigarette just to watch the smoke disappear. The truth slammed into me harder than any cop could. The cartel already knew. Maybe they didn't know my name yet, but they knew someone had their money, and their kind of search didn't involve lost and found posters. I thought about burning it, about dragging the bag to the edge of the water and letting the Atlantic swallow it whole. But my hands wouldn't move. 8 million was more than bills and survival. It was the door I'd been beating on my entire life, now cracked open. To slam it shut would be to admit I was meant to die the same way I'd lived, broke, invisible, forgotten. When dawn broke, I was still staring at the ocean, telling myself lies I half believed. That I could outsmart them. That Miami was big enough to hide me. That maybe fate had finally handed me something worth the risk. But under all of it, one truth throbbed like a toothache. I hadn't stolen money. I had stolen time, and sooner or later, someone would come to collect the debt. The first week passed in a haze of lies and cigarette smoke. Every day I woke up telling myself I still had a choice, and every night I fell asleep staring at the bag like it was a wild animal I'd locked in my closet, waiting for the cage to break. The city went on beating its drum, and I kept driving my cab as if routine could save me. But the problem with money this loud is that it starts echoing in places you don't want it to. The police cruiser wasn't the last sign. By the fourth night, I noticed a black SUV parked outside my building. Windows tinted so dark they could hide ghosts. I told myself it was coincidence, but coincidence doesn't smoke cigarettes at the same time every night. I stopped going in through the front door. I started parking blocks away, sneaking in through alleys like a thief in my own life. And then she showed up. Her name was Elena, a nurse at Jackson Memorial. I picked her up outside the hospital on a double shift, her scrubs wrinkled, her hair tied back in a way that made her look both exhausted and untouchable. She was the kind of passenger who should have been just another face, but when she looked at me in the rearview mirror, it wasn't suspicion I saw. It was recognition, like she knew I was carrying something heavy. She asked me if I was okay. Nobody had asked me that in years. I lied, but the lie didn't land. For 3 nights in a row, I found myself waiting outside that hospital at the same time, pretending it was coincidence when she walked out. She didn't question it. She slid into the cab and filled the silence with stories about patients who lived, patients who didn't, about trying to stitch together a city that kept tearing itself open. I never told her about the bag, but the way she spoke about fighting for people who didn't even thank her, it made me feel like maybe I could still claw back a piece of my soul. But Miami doesn't allow redemption without cost. One night after dropping her off, I returned home to find my apartment door ajar. The lock was broken. The air smelled of cheap cologne and danger. The bag was still there, untouched, but that was worse. It meant whoever had been inside wasn't just looking for money. They were looking for me. On the kitchen table was a single bullet, polished, standing upright like a candle. My name wasn't written on it, but the message was clear. The countdown had started. I didn't tell Elena. I couldn't drag her into it. But her face haunted me even more than the bullet did. I had stolen from monsters, and now I was falling in love at the exact moment when love was a liability. It was the kind of twisted joke the universe specialized in. The cab became my confessional. Every mile I drove with her in the back seat, I rehearsed the truth in my head, and every time I opened my mouth, fear welded it shut. The cartel hadn't knocked on my door yet, but I could feel them circling, patient as wolves. The money was no longer just money, it was bait, and I was already bleeding. And still, in the middle of that spiral, a part of me wanted to believe that maybe, just maybe, Elena was the reason I'd stolen it in the first place. Not for myself, but for the possibility of something more than survival. That was the most dangerous lie of all. By the time the second week bled into the third, I was no longer waiting for the wolves. I could hear them breathing. The black SUV stopped pretending to be casual. It followed me 3 nights in a row, keeping 2 cars back, headlights always in my mirror. Once, when I tried to shake it, it cut me off on the causeway, forcing me to pull over. Nobody got out. They just sat there, engine idling, until I drove off again. That was worse than being shot at. It meant they were letting me know, "We see you, and we can take you whenever we choose." The bullet on my kitchen table had been replaced 2 days later with something new. A Polaroid. Grainy, yellow-tinged, but unmistakable. Elena, leaving the hospital, a coffee cup in hand, smiling at something out of frame. My hands shook so bad the photo almost tore. The message was clear. My secrets weren't mine anymore. Whatever I thought I was protecting her from was already gone. I should have told her then. Instead, I lied again. I picked her up after her shift and forced a smile while she talked about how tired she was, how sometimes saving lives felt like throwing buckets of water into a burning building. She said she liked riding with me because I listened. I bit my tongue bloody not to tell her what kind of fire she'd stepped into. That night I made a decision. If they wanted me, they'd get me, but not her. I dug through the bag, pulled out 1 brick of cash, and left the rest wrapped tight. $100,000, small compared to the mountain in my closet, but more money than I'd ever held in one place before that night. I put it in a shoebox and slid it under the seat of the cab. Insurance. A way out if things went bad. Not for me, for her. The storm finally broke on a Tuesday. I was driving through Little Havana when the SUV cut me off again, this time with no patience left. Doors swung open, and 2 men stepped out. Not suits this time. Jeans, leather jackets, eyes that had seen more graves than I'd driven miles. One leaned down to my window, pressed a pistol against the glass without saying a word. The other slid into the back seat like he was a fare. His breath smelled of mint gum and menace. He spoke softly, like we were friends. He said the bag wasn't mine. He said the owners wanted it back. He said if I cooperated, maybe I'd still get to breathe Miami air by the weekend. Then he leaned forward, his lips almost touching my ear, and whispered Elena's name. My stomach turned to ice. I didn't argue. I didn't make a scene. I drove where they told me, the guns still kissing my temple. They directed me to a warehouse by the docks, the kind of place where stories don't end. They just disappear. Inside, the lights buzzed, the air thick with gasoline and salt. The bag wasn't in my trunk. I'd been too careful, but they didn't care. They wanted me, not just the money. A man waited for us, different from the others. Taller, cleaner, a pressed shirt under his leather jacket. His eyes didn't blink enough. He didn't introduce himself, but I knew he was the one in charge. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He just looked at me like I was already dead and said, "You have what's ours. You will return it. And until then, you belong to us." I left that warehouse alive, but not free. They hadn't killed me because I was more useful alive. That was the cruelest part. I wasn't a thief anymore. I was a pawn. And pawns don't choose their moves. That night, back in my cab, I sat behind the wheel staring at the shoebox under the seat. The only choice I had left was how much of myself I was willing to trade before the game ended. The deal was simple. I was theirs until they had their money back. But with men like that, nothing is simple. They didn't want the bag returned quietly. They wanted me to fetch it, to prove my loyalty, to bleed for the privilege of staying alive. I knew it was a leash, and the leash only ever gets tighter. They started giving me errands. Small at first. Drive a package from Wynwood to Hialeah. Pick up a stranger at the airport, no questions asked. Leave the car running while men I didn't know carried duffels heavier than sin into the trunk. Each time I told myself I was buying time. Each time I swallowed another lie. The shoebox with Elena's escaped money stayed under the seat, but I knew if they ever found it, it'd be the end of both of us. I began parking blocks away from her apartment, watching from a distance, terrified that even looking at her too long would put a target on her back. Still, every night she called to ask if I was okay, and every night I lied through clenched teeth. It was during one of those errands that the first real chance came. They sent me to a nightclub downtown, a place pulsing with lights and sweat, to collect a man named Raoul. He was drunk, coked up, and loud, bragging about things that should never be said out loud in a city like Miami. I drove him across town while he poured his sins into the back seat. That's when he let it slip. He wasn't supposed to, but the cocaine loosened his tongue. The money I had taken wasn't just cartel profit. It was a payout meant for someone bigger, someone untouchable. That meant I hadn't just stolen from killers. I disrupted an alliance. It explained everything. Why they hadn't shot me in that warehouse. Why they were holding me close instead of burying me in the Everglades. I wasn't just a thief. I was leverage. When I dropped Roll off, I didn't go home. I drove straight to the ocean, parked by the pier, and stared at the waves crashing black against the shore. 8 million wasn't just salvation or damnation anymore. It was a bargaining chip in a game I didn't understand, and the only question left was whether I could play it before they decided my role was finished. That night I dreamt of Elena's face, pale and bloodied, with the bullet from my kitchen table lodged in her skull. I woke up soaked in sweat, the city still humming outside my window like nothing had changed. But inside, something had snapped. I couldn't just drive and obey. I had to use what I had, turn their leash into a weapon. The next morning, I moved the bag. Not far, just enough. I found an abandoned storage unit near the river, the kind of place nobody visits unless they have ghosts. I stashed it there, padlocked the door, memorized the number. For the first time since opening that trunk, I felt something that wasn't fear. It wasn't freedom either. It was control, small and fragile, but mine. The cartel thought they owned me. What they didn't know was that I still held the only thing they truly cared about. And if I played it right, maybe I could turn $8 million of stolen blood money into the one thing I'd never had in my life, a way out. The last act of the game came without warning. One moment I was driving down Biscayne. The next I was boxed in by 2 cars, one in front, one behind, forcing me onto a dead-end street near the docks. They dragged me out, not with shouts, but with calm, practiced violence. No masks, no need for them. When men are certain of your death, they don't hide their faces. They led me into the same warehouse where it had started, where the man with the pressed shirt and dead eyes waited. The duffels sat on the table between us. My heart nearly stopped. It meant they had found it. Except they hadn't. I'd left the real bag locked in the storage unit. This one was bait, filled with old phone books wrapped in duct tape, just enough weight to pass a quick glance. The man studied me, his stare drilling through bone. He told me I had one last chance, return the money and walk away or watch Elena die. My chest locked up. They had her. They had taken her shift after work or followed her home, or worse. My blood went cold until he slid a photo across the table. It wasn't Elena. It was me, sitting in my cab, staring out at the bay. They hadn't touched her yet. They were testing me. That's when I understood. The only way to win was to stop playing. If I returned the money, they'd kill me anyway. If I refused, they'd use Elena to break me. So I made a choice, the kind that burns everything behind you. I told them I'd take them to the real bag. They piled into the cab, gun to my ribs, eyes glued to my hands on the wheel. I drove them through the city, the neon bleeding across the windshield like stained glass, and every turn brought me closer to the bridge over the bay. Halfway across, I floored the gas and jerked the wheel hard. The cab smashed through the barrier, glass exploding, the ocean yawning open beneath us. For a frozen second, their screams drowned out the roar of the engine. Then water swallowed everything. The shock of the Atlantic hit like concrete. Cold, violent, merciless. The cab sank fast, the gunmen thrashing, their weapons useless in the dark flood. I clawed at the window, lungs screaming, until my hand found the release and I kicked free. The water dragged me under, spun me like laundry, but instinct shoved me upward toward a slice of moonlight. I broke the surface coughing salt, my chest on fire. Behind me, the cab vanished, pulling 2 men and a fake fortune into the black depths. I swam until my arms felt like stone, until the lights of Miami blurred into a smear of gold and blue. When I finally dragged myself onto the rocks, I lay there shivering, laughing a laugh that sounded more like sobbing. The bag was still out there, waiting in the storage unit. $8 million. Enough to disappear, to buy silence, to rewrite a life. But as I lay on those rocks, staring at the city that wanted me dead, I knew the truth. The money wasn't freedom. It was a curse. At dawn, I walked to Elena's building. She opened the door, her eyes tired, searching my face for answers I couldn't give. I didn't tell her about the ocean, the guns, the blood I'd left behind. I just told her we needed to leave. Not tomorrow. Now. Maybe I'd keep the money. Maybe I'd burn it. Maybe the cartel would hunt me to the end of the earth. None of that mattered anymore. For the first time since that night on Collins Avenue, I felt alive, not because I had stolen something, but because I had chosen something. The city would remember me as a thief. The cartel would remember me as a traitor. But Elena? If I was lucky, she'd remember me as the man who finally stopped running. And if you followed me this far, if you've tasted the smoke, the fear, the salt water in your lungs, then you already know, not every victory feels sweet. Some victories taste like ash and gasoline, and they leave scars you can't wash off. If you want more stories that cut this deep, leave a like and subscribe. Because trust me, this ride isn't over.